May I have your attention? Please welcome TechCrunch senior writer Roman Delay, Jean Berdichevsky, co-founder and CEO of Sila, and Erin Price-Wright, partner, Index Ventures.
All right, thank you, all of you, for coming. If you want to move to the front row, you can move. There's not a lot of you here, so don't be shy. You can move to the front row. And if you have questions for Erin and Jean, there's a QR code that you can probably see on the screen right here. Scan this with your phone, and then you can ask your own questions. I have a phone here, so I can see your questions and ask them to Erin and Jean. Maybe some of you were upstairs at the TechCrunch Plus stage at your session that you were just finishing maybe 10 minutes ago, something like that. And we've got a few questions from there, so you can ask questions right now, but I'm going to start with some questions that we got earlier. So there's one question for Jean, for instance. How do you know it's the right time to raise from corporate investors like Daimler? Do you lose some autonomy by taking on strategic investments?
Yeah, that's a very important question to ask as a founder. In general, it's never the right time to raise from a strategic investor because in general, you always lose some amount of autonomy. And I think it's really easy to underestimate the option value of being able to do whatever you want in the future, especially when you're small and you're hoping to get big. You underestimate how important it is when you're bigger to have the freedom to tack left or right. The other thing I think you usually underestimate is how much big corporate strategies change. And so whoever's making that investment at the time, is likely gone by the time you're having to pivot. So in general, I advise people against it unless the strategic is going to let you have the autonomy you need, and that depends on the deal, and they better write a very, very big check. And in the case of Mercedes, they led our $200 million financing that we closed in early 2019, but that was in 2018 when frankly nobody else cared. Yeah. And the structure of it allows them to be first to market with our technology, and they will be, but it doesn't prevent us from working with anyone else. And we'll have other customers.
And have you seen any change since that?
So we were incredibly fortunate. I handed the term sheet to the head of development for all cars at Mercedes. We signed that term sheet 20 days later, and in that span, the CEO of Mercedes stepped down and our sponsor became the CEO. And so I have not seen any strategic change, but in part because we got to a very fortunate position where basically we were the CEO's first investment.
Yeah, maybe I should have started with a short introduction with the two of you, what you do. Maybe you can talk about Sila for
Sure, yeah. So we're a battery technology company. We make kind of the next generation chemistry that will go into lithium-ion batteries that power everything from consumer devices to cars. Our technology allows the battery to store a lot more energy in a smaller volume, and that's critical for small devices. You can imagine it's also very valuable for cars because you can reduce the physical size of your battery pack, increase the performance of the vehicle, and by using fewer cells to achieve the same range, the battery pack gets cheaper.
Yeah. And Erin at Index Ventures, what do you do?
Yes, I'm a partner at Index Ventures, focusing mostly on AI, infra, and harder tech. Index Ventures is a global multi-stage venture capital fund, so we invest in founders all the way from Series Seed, very early stage, a couple people in their garage, through to kind of larger pre-IPO growth companies. So, $1 to $100 million.
And can you mention some of your investments?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the ones we're very excited about right now is Figma. We led their seed round, did every single round since participated. So that's a big moment for us. Also, investors more relevant in this category to Aurora, self-driving cars, Covariant, AI-empowered robotics for supply chain manufacturing, Cohere, large language models, among others.
I had a question for you, Erin.
Yes.
So I can't find it.
Oh, maybe I'll make one additional point on the strategic question.
Yeah.
I think one thing to really keep in mind is, to be really careful about the terms you take in terms of things like information rights and sharing, and are they on your board, and how will that affect your relationship with other customers before you necessarily take a strategic angel check. So it's not usually just cash. What are the other strings attached that they want, and be really thoughtful about those.
Yeah, so I found the question again. Erin, how do you make sure long-term investments will be well-funded to ship something? Do you have to invest in multiple rounds over multiple years, just like in Figma, I guess?
Yes, sure. So it's generally Index's philosophy that we try to invest. That's why we have multiple funds for multiple stages. When I look at our growth fund, for example, which is kind of Series B to pre-IPO, more than half of our investments out of our growth fund are follow-ons from early stage. So we go in with the intention of doubling down on our winners and have deep pockets to be able to do that. And it's for deeper tech or harder tech companies, I think that could be a really valuable asset to make sure that you have an investor that can follow on and participate in later rounds, potentially if you need it. So I think that's a big consideration.
And I'd say like having a big checkbook, finding investors with really big checkbooks is a top 2 consideration from the founder perspective, doing hard tech things for a decade. There's going to be moments where some financing doesn't come together at the 11th hour. We've had those moments, and we were just so fortunate to have the investors we've had. And in retrospect, they got a great benefit out of it, out of those moments.
Were you looking at the size of the funds before accepting?
Beggars can't be choosers. I'd say in the first 7 years, we weren't necessarily so judgy. We just were very fortunate to end up with those kind of funds that could sort of back up the truck when needed.
Yeah, and I would definitely, as you're diligencing your investors, try to understand, look at the composition of their growth fund. And because there are a lot of investors that also have a growth fund, but they're operated independently, so they very rarely double down and follow on for big rounds. So there's a lot of intricacies around how venture capital funds are structured that I think a lot of founders, especially first-time founders, don't realize. So it's important to do your homework.
Yeah. So I have a 2-part question, which is pretty good. There's one part for each of you. How did you get an investor to write the first check? And what convinces you to write someone's first check? So each perspective.
I mean, I was very fortunate. I met our lead investor when I was at Tesla. He got to know me. I got to know him. I became an entrepreneur in residence at Sutter Hill Ventures, which certainly isn't a promise to invest, but it's a good indication that they're interested. And then I spent a year looking for a company that I was very excited about building. Or technology I was excited about building a company around, and using that firm as feedback of whether this was a good idea or not. And they have a 50-year track record of some of the highest returns in all of Silicon Valley. So their feedback was very useful to pinpointing a problem and an approach that would be highly investable. So I basically, you could say I spent a year figuring that problem out.
And this is good timing because I won't share who, but I just wrote the first check into a company this week. So what was on my mind when I did that? They're 2, extremely talented researchers with a long track record of building kind of things that went from sort of research inception to production. The 2 founders have known each other for a long time and have a deep working relationship. So this wasn't a speed dating situation. Despite their depth of technical expertise, they have really strong kind of product and customer empathy. So even though this is going to take a pretty long time to build, they're thinking about the right primitives. They're not trying to move too fast. For example, with Figma, this is one thing that really stood out with Dylan early on. He took more than 4 years to commercialize the product. For a software company, that's a really long time. And so, but he had this long-term vision, strong product principles, and real technical depth. So that's the type of thing I tend to look for. And then coupled with a real change in the world, what are they capitalizing on? A rising tide, a big movement, a large change in our society, a large change in the way technology or software happens, and they just happen to have that perfect Venn diagram of those 3 skills, so I wrote their first check.
Nice. Another question, how should hard tech founders be thinking about raising dilutive funding in the very early stages of the journey during the tech validation phase? So I guess, how do you make sure you don't get too diluted?
I think there's two things. I mean, it depends on who you're raising the money from. Obviously, if you sort of give away 80% of your company before you ever got started, like it makes it hard for the next investor to invest. But certainly as you're building a long time horizon company, one thing to remember is no company's ever died from dilution. Companies die from running out of cash, and so I think you just have to figure out what's your position, right? What are your alternatives? I think if there's no alternatives, like, great, like raise a dilutive round and keep going, because you can true things up in the future. You can make sure the founders are taken care of, especially if you're raising from good people, and then the founders make sure the employees are taken care of. It trues up over time in some respects.
But can you stay motivated if there's been so many rounds that?
I think if you're doing, I think about it as I'd rather have a small piece of something insanely large and actually make an impact on the world. And I think that's what the motivation doesn't come from the financial return. If I'm having to build some, forgive me, middleware like SaaS company that nobody but a few people, IT managers kind of care about, like, you're going to have to motivate me with a lot of money. If I have an opportunity to completely transform the world, doesn't matter if I end up with, 3% or 30% of the company. It honestly doesn't at the end of the day. Now, I care a lot more that my employees are taken care of. I care a lot more that I care about the people in the company, and so I'm going to push for not getting a dilutive financing because of the team, and certainly, I benefit from that as well. But I think if you're truly motivated by making an impact, like that's not the thing that should. If you're thinking about that, you're in the wrong. Hard tech's not for you.
I don't know though. Just to play devil's advocate for a second, I do think that you have to be careful about understanding what options you could be closing off later. If you're pre-Series A and you're already massively diluted, it definitely limits your options for investors later on, because it's something that we certainly look at. It's not like the be-all, end-all decision.
No, you don't want to have to make the next investor fix a problem, right? So I think there are market rates, and I think if you're getting started, like I said, giving away 80% of your company is a really bad idea, because you're not going to get Erin to write the next check, right? Like, I don't know, you're Series A, so what do you look for? Like, if investors have over
There's no hard and fast rule, I'd say, but it's definitely something. Yeah,
if they have more than 30%.
Yeah. Pick a number.
Right.
But I think that being really, if you do have to take a dilutive early stage. First of all, especially for harder tech or deeper tech companies, there are a lot of alternative sources of capital to help bridge gaps here and there. There are grants, university funding, government things. There's a lot of programs that I think founders should be taking advantage of. Tax incentives. The other thing is, if you are going to take a dilutive round, be really careful what the terms of the round are and make sure that you're protected for future rounds. So sometimes, especially across Europe for university spinouts, for example, there can be really, really punitive terms from raising capital from certain types of venture funds. And that makes it very hard for investors to come in later on. So I would have, there are founders that I know that I would have told them earlier stage to take a more dilutive round from a higher quality investor that wasn't going to screw them later with the terms in the term sheet than what might have looked like a friendlier round early on that had a lot of strings attached.
And I think partly because great investors, right, they have choice in where they put their money. And so, like, while they want to make an impact, the last thing they want is to have, to have brain damage from dealing with some prior investor that's already turned the cap table upside down. So I think quality over
if you're going to take a dilutive round, take it from a good investor that's going to work for you and that's not going to hurt you later on.
And that others will follow, because then, like, they can help, like that. That's much more important.
Erin, a question for you. What is your strategy to identify white spaces and source such cool deals in general?
Really good question. So I don't know if I have one particular strategy, or we certainly don't have one strategy as a fund. I would say like two things that we do a lot, especially in the kind of deeper tech space. I read a lot. Like I spend, hours a week reading and just trying to keep up with the areas that I'm interested in. What is the latest research? Who's doing that research? What are the conferences are happening that in this space? Like what's coming out? And people are pretty receptive to cold outbound if you're not trying to talk about funding, but you actually want to talk about what they're working on, to just understand what's going on. And that means that when you see a company in this area, you're informed, you have a clear thesis, you've thought about it, you're not coming up from nothing, and it helps build a relationship with the founder a lot more quickly. That's one thing. And then the second thing is, a lot of our investments in this space do come from introductions from other people. So, the CEO of Aurora introduces us to someone he knows that he thinks is really smart. So using that, our founder network and our operator network actually really helps us find things before they're really even things. Those would be my two.
Question for Jean. How did you go about that year of finding the tech around which you wanted to build the company? What gave you the conviction?
How do I find the technology? Like I said, I spent a year doing it. I probably looked at 50 different ideas. I'd say a dozen I dug in deeply. 2 that I almost started. 1 I actually committed to start and backed out of doing the next day because it was, the wrong thing.
Always sleep on it.
Yeah, after I exactly. What for me, being very technical, it was not hard to sort of wrap my head around like why technically something might work or not work or what I could solve, but not having that sort of business lens. I basically spent that year coming into the partners' offices at Sutter Hill and saying, look, I got these ideas and they're great because of this, and they'd say, that one sucks, that one sucks, that one's mediocre, that one sucks, that one's okay. It's like, okay, why, right? And we would unpack each one and I'd be like, you're wrong about this one, and I'd go back and get more data, et cetera. And so what ultimately I learned is that the lens that you look at, from the venture side of why something is or isn't a good investment, and in particular, every venture investor's lens is different, but what I looked for is an idea that was technically so insanely hard that very few people in the world would solve it, but from a business go-to-market standpoint, if you solve it, it would be easy to adopt and easy to deploy. And so that's the type of problem that I'm best suited to solve, because I can rally an insanely great technical team, and I'm still learning a lot about go-to-market and getting that right. But turns out, like, if you ask people, do you want a better battery in your car? They go, yeah, I do. So I think the business lens was actually the more important part for me, and I think for a lot of technical co-founders, it should be the more important part.
So a very methodical approach. You think founders or wannabe founders, they should evaluate like a dozen ideas before committing to one?
Yeah, I think, the other thing I did, just to kind of back up even before, I was very lucky to be an EIR, but I actually saved all my money for the first sort of 4 years of working to where I could live for a year without working, ramen noodles and whatnot. But I kind of had this notion in my head that a lot of people try to start a company on their nights and weekends, and maybe that's a good idea. Sometimes you get lucky, but the reality is, I'm committing 10 plus years of my life, hopefully 20, 30 years to an idea. When you think about it that way, it's kind of insane not to spend a year figuring out what you're going to do. And so, I basically had a piggy bank that I broke open and said, I'm going to use every penny to find an idea for a year. And then, luckily I actually, got a spot and got a salary and didn't have to just eat ramen noodles.
Yeah, that's smart. All right, we have time for one more question for you, Erin. Do venture funds give grants with relaxed term sheets for promising projects that might take a while to commercialize? Can grants be an option? So how do venture funds?
I don't know any venture funds that give away grants. Maybe some do.
It's always capital for equity, right?
Yeah, usually it's capital for equity. Some funds will do like what Jean did and do an entrepreneur in residence. So if there's someone really talented, maybe they'll be able to spend some time thinking about and ideating on something before that there's a company to invest in. governments give grants, and there's also often, there's sometimes accelerators give grants.
There
other
are some
places.
amazing accelerators, right?
Yeah.
So Activate, which used to be called Cyclotron Road for hard tech founders. I mean, you get $500,000, 2 years, and access to all the facilities in like Berkeley National Labs to do science, plus a bunch of mentorship, right? So there are programs like that if you're looking for non-dilutive.
Yeah, I would consider non-traditional venture as the best bet for grants.
Yeah. So there you go. Well, thank you for coming here, asking nice questions, and we'll see you around at Disrupt. Thank you.